It began, as most quiet things do, in the stillness of ancient evenings, long before there were clocks or even proper calendars. When the first people looked at fruit that had fallen too long beneath a tree and noticed that it behaved strangely when eaten. The air in those early valleys of Mesopotamia and along the Nile carried the scent of overripe sweetness, a slow perfume that spoke of something happening invisibly, sugars surrendering to unseen lives, to the microscopic labor of wild yeasts that no one then could name but everyone somehow felt. They didn't yet know what fermentation was, nor did they need to. They simply noticed that when the fruit juice sat in a jar, sealed roughly with leaves and clay, it changed. The flavor deepened, the texture softened, and when consumed, it made them feel both lighter and slower, as if the world's edges had blurred ever so slightly. In the earliest clay villages, long before written words, there must have been evenings when small groups sat in the dim orange flicker of firelight, passing a crude bowl between them, taking cautious sips of the strange new drink that made laughter come more easily and worries fade into gentle forgetfulness. The vessels were porous, the flavor uneven, and yet the memory of that sensation, the mild dizziness, the soft unraveling of thought, would stay in humanity's bloodstream forever. Over time, as people settled and the concept of storage became an art of its own, the practice of letting things rest in jars evolved into something deliberate. In the river towns of Sumer, women who brewed by instinct became quiet custodians of this transformation, setting their jars on warm shelves, watching the bubbles rise and subside, feeling the pulse of something both living and dying inside the liquid. Every household had its recipe, a little grain, a little honey, a patience learned from waiting through heat and harvest. The first brewers didn't call it alcohol. They called it saikaru, meaning sweet drink, and it was as much a part of their offerings to the gods as their daily bread. On temple steps, clay tablets recorded the distribution of beer rations, showing how workers who built the walls of Uruk were paid not in coins but in measures of drinkable joy. Yet there was nothing wild or celebratory about it. No music, no taverns, just a routine exchange, a mild comfort against thirst and monotony. Each sip was a reminder of the earth's generosity and decay entwined across the desert sands. In Egypt, the pattern repeated itself with the same slow rhythm of human need and curiosity. The Nile's yearly flooding left behind rich sediment perfect for growing barley, and the Egyptians, meticulous in their habits, soon turned fermentation into a craft that bordered on religious duty. Within their cool stone breweries, women crushed grain with wooden pestles, mixed it with warm water, and allowed the mixture to rest until it frothed. They filtered it through woven baskets, poured it into amphorae, and sealed the tops with wax and linen. Hieroglyphs show servants carrying tall jugs to banquets where the beer was thick as porridge, flavored with dates and herbs. Pharaohs drank it, peasants drank it. Even children were given diluted versions. It was nourishment, medicine, and prayer in one. When someone died, beer accompanied them into the tomb, because it was thought that even in the afterlife, one might wish to rest with a mild, familiar warmth spreading through the chest. And yet, through all of this, the process itself remained oddly mysterious, a quiet chemistry that people respected without ever truly understanding. The rhythm of fermentation became humanity's companion, a silent clock marking the days, in clay houses, in reed huts, and later in wooden halls. The jars sat undisturbed in the corners, breathing softly, transforming without complaint. There were no measurements, no instruments, only waiting and observing. People learned to taste the air, to sense the change in temperature, to feel when the liquid was ready. And in those moments of tasting, something profound and simple was born. The recognition that human life could be altered, not by violence or conquest, but by patience and rot. To drink was to share in the slow decay of the world, to welcome it gently instead of fearing it. That sense of slowness, of quiet surrender, echoed through generations, binding farmers, brewers, and priests in a common ritual of waiting for the invisible to reveal itself. As centuries drifted by, each civilization added its own flavor to the act of drinking. The Babylonians sang hymns to Ninkasi, goddess of beer, thanking her for satisfying the desire of the heart in the cool evening air. Clay cups clinked softly against stone tables, and the night hummed with the low comfort of repetition. Across the Mediterranean, the Greeks would later claim wine as their sacred drink. But here, in these early river valleys, beer was the golden beginning. It wasn't wild indulgence. It was domestic magic, a household miracle that turned ordinary grain into something mildly transcendent. The drinkers didn't yet call it getting drunk. They simply called it peace. And as their eyes grew heavy and the fire crackled low, they must have felt the world turning a little slower, softer, as if time itself had taken a long sip and sighed. So when we ask when people started getting wasted, the answer hides, not in taverns or feasts, but in the quiet patience of those first jars. It wasn't a rebellion against order. It was a tender acceptance of nature's rhythm. Long before humans built cities or carved laws, they learned to wait for fermentation, to trust that what spoiled could also soothe. And perhaps that is why even today, after millennia of refinement, the act of drinking carries with it the faint echo of those first nights in the ancient dark, when someone somewhere realized that the world could be made just a little more bearable by simply letting things rest and change on their own. After the slow bubbling of barley and dates had become an ordinary part of life along the rivers, another quiet transformation began to take root among the pale hills of the eastern Mediterranean, where the soil was stony and the wind always carried the faint scent of salt and dust. Vines, thin and stubborn, crept over terraces carved by hands, and these vines, left to their own rhythm, produced small, bitter berries that no one at first thought worth tasting. Yet someone, perhaps a shepherd with more time than ambition, noticed that when the grapes were pressed and left alone in clay jars, their juice darkened, grew fragrant, and after some days acquired the same soft magic that the people of Mesopotamia knew from their beer. This was the beginning of wine, though no one called it that yet. It was simply another quiet accident that turned patience into a kind of devotion. The ancient villages of Anatolia and the Aegean began to smell of fermentation and of evenings spent slowly filling and emptying small cups, their surfaces shimmering in the glow of oil lamps. Every season brought a repetition of the same patient gestures: picking, pressing, pouring, waiting. And through these gestures, people learned not only to make a drink, but to mark time itself. The making of wine was gentler than the brewing of beer. It required fewer grains and more silence. The jars were stored in shaded rooms where the air stayed cool and heavy with the scent of earth. Bees drifted lazily around the openings, and each vessel seemed to breathe in the darkness, exhaling warmth and memory. Over generations, the act of tending vines became something close to ritual. The Greeks later told stories of Dionysus, a god who was both joyous and sad, who taught humans to cultivate vines as a gift that could make them forget pain, but also remember how small they were. The farmers did not see him as wild. They saw him as patient, returning each spring with the tender leaves. In the Greek countryside, wine was mixed with water, never swallowed neat, because moderation itself was considered a form of respect, not only for the gods, but for the body that had to rise again with the sun. Yet, even in their moderation, they built entire festivals around the slow sharing of drink, where poets recited verses about longing, and philosophers debated whether pleasure was a virtue or a weakness. The amphorae lined the courtyards like silent witnesses, their painted necks depicting satyrs and vines intertwined, reminders that joy and decay often wear the same colors in the houses of Athens. Slaves and servants poured diluted wine into shallow cups that caught the flicker of lamplight. The conversations drifted as slowly as the smoke that rose from burning olive oil. Men spoke of geometry and virtue, but underneath their words ran the same soft current that had run beneath the barley fields of Sumer, a yearning for stillness, a wish to forget the weight of time. When the night grew longer, they reclined on couches, watching the small ripples form as the wine was stirred, the surface glimmering like a small piece of the sea trapped in a bowl. Outside, in the countryside, the women who had picked the grapes slept early, their hands stained purple, their dreams scented with the sweetness of crushed fruit. And in that mingling of labor and rest, of stain and sweetness, wine became more than drink. It became memory itself, a way of keeping the warmth of summer alive through the winter months. As empires rose and crumbled, the jars changed shape but not purpose. The Phoenicians, ever restless sailors, carried them across the sea, trading not only liquid, but the idea of relaxation, of surrender to slowness. In their ships, rows of amphorae were packed like organs in a great stone body, and the rhythm of the waves kept the liquid inside, swaying gently, aging as it traveled. The Romans later perfected this movement, for the wine it produced, as if geography existed merely to flavor their leisure. Their estates were full of presses and vats, their villas echoing with the sound of steady dripping from freshly crushed grapes. For them, to drink was to participate in civilization itself. A cup of wine was a small, daily ceremony that separated the citizen from the barbarian. Yet beneath the grandeur, it remained a household ritual, no different from the first clay jars left beside the rivers, a patient waiting for transformation, a soft respect for the invisible work of time. And so, across centuries, the vine wound itself through human history, slow and unstoppable. It climbed through ruins, through gardens, through prayers. It was there in the monasteries of medieval Europe, where monks copied ancient texts by candlelight and kept barrels of wine aging in the cool cellars below. They drank little, but they cared for the vines, as if tending a memory of paradise. In their silence, they understood what the ancients had always known, that fermentation was not invention, but observation, that all one had to do was allow nature to change at its own pace. Each sip, whether taken by a shepherd or a philosopher or a monk, carried with it the same faint sigh of surrender. To drink was to be reminded of decay, yet also of endurance. The liquid shimmered like the passing of seasons, then clear again, and those who tasted it felt the world slow to the rhythm of their breathing. By the time the vine had spread from Persia to Gaul, from the deserts to the green valleys, it was no longer just drink, but identity. Regions were known by their flavors, and people began to describe themselves through the land's taste. Yet even as trade and wealth grew, the act of drinking remained deeply personal, almost prayerful. A cup raised at sunset, a sip taken in the stillness before sleep. These were the moments when humanity felt closest to its origins, to the first jars beneath the trees, to the unseen miracle of transformation. And perhaps it was this recognition, half forgotten but always felt, that kept wine at the center of human life. A quiet reminder that change, like fermentation, cannot be hurried. It must be waited for, watched, and finally accepted with a gentle heart. It is said that after the last echoes of Rome had faded into dust, and the empire's grand villas stood roofless under the patient gaze of the sky, people began to gather once again in smaller rooms, darker rooms, humbler rooms, where the scent of smoke and bread was stronger than the memory of marble. The world had shrunk, as if humanity had folded inward for warmth, and in that folding the old habit of drinking found new places to rest. The monasteries had kept the vines alive, but it was the village taverns that brought the drink back to the people, one wooden cup at a time. These were not places of song and riot, at least not in the beginning. They were slow, dim spaces, thick with the sighs of travelers and the quiet hum of rain outside. The air carried a mixture of hay, sweat, and fermented sweetness. A small fire burned low in the hearth, never quite enough to chase the cold, but enough to remind one that time was passing. And so, from the quiet decadence of emperors, drinking became again the consolation of peasants, a way to measure evenings, to make the silence of winter tolerable, to stretch the hours until sleep. The tavern keeper was often a widow, or a man too old for fieldwork, someone who knew the worth of patience. Behind the counter, he would keep barrels of ale, each one a small universe of taste and waiting. Ale, unlike wine, was for the north, for the lands where vines refused to grow and the people found comfort in the steady hum of grain. The process had changed little since the days of Sumer. Barley was soaked, boiled, cooled, and left to ferment under a thin film of froth. Herbs and roots were added to soften the bitterness, long before anyone had heard the name of hops. And when it was ready, it was ladled out in heavy clay mugs that retained the warmth of the hand, passed from one traveler to another with slow nods instead of words. The drink itself was mild, cloudy, thick, and nourishing, a kind of liquid bread. It was taken not to escape life, but to survive it, to ease the weariness of those who plowed and sewed and stitched as the centuries drifted through the long twilight of the Middle Ages. The tavern became a fixture in every village, every crossroad, every walled town. It was a place where news traveled at the speed of conversation, where merchants spoke of distant fairs, where tired soldiers removed their boots and stared at the fire as if waiting for their memories to evaporate. Yet the mood of these rooms was never wild. It was weary, gentle, and cyclic. The same conversations, the same faces, the same uneven benches. The rhythm of the tavern was that of a heartbeat slowed by routine. A man might drink 3 mugs of ale in an evening and never raise his voice, only sigh a little deeper. The candles burned down slowly, and the floor, strewn with straw, muffled every sound. Outside, the village slept early, its lanes wet with dew, its roofs glistening under the moon. Inside, the smell of yeast and ash lingered like an old prayer. Meanwhile, the monasteries continued their experiments in silence. Their cellars were cooler, their barrels larger, their methods precise. The monks, bound by vows of moderation, drank in measured sips, but their devotion to the craft was boundless. In the stone cloisters of France, Belgium, and England, they refined the brewing of ale into an art of contemplation. They studied the temperature of fermentation, the purity of water, the subtle influence of herbs. For them, brewing was not indulgence, but meditation, the transformation of nature into nourishment through patience. Each morning, they tended their kettles, stirring the mash with slow, circular movements, whispering prayers that blurred into the rhythm of the bubbling liquid. The result was a drink that carried not joy but calm, not laughter but stillness. Even in their silence, the monks kept alive the ancient knowledge that had once belonged to Sumerian women by the rivers, that to ferment was to cooperate with time in the towns beyond the monastery walls. Life grew a little louder, but only a little. The markets bustled by day, yet by evening, the same quiet gravity drew people toward the tavern again. There they sat, shoulder to shoulder, warming their hands against their mugs, sharing stories that all sounded vaguely the same, about harvests, about weather, about distant wars no one truly believed in. Sometimes a traveler would speak of cities across the sea, of spices and silks, of wine that tasted of sunlight. And for a brief moment, the room would listen more closely. But even then, the fascination would fade as the drink cooled, and someone would throw another log into the fire, watching the embers pulse red like slow heartbeats. It was not intoxication they sought, but rhythm, the assurance that every evening would unfold in the same sequence of light, warmth, and forgetting. By the late medieval years, the tavern had become so much a part of daily life that it appeared in the margins of chronicles, in the letters of monks, in the complaints of kings who feared their soldiers spent more time drinking than fighting. But even these warnings sounded tired, as if acknowledging something inevitable and harmless. The act of drinking was no longer rebellion. It was continuity. The alehouses, inns, and mead halls carried forward the same impulse that had begun with those first jars under the Mesopotamian stars, the need to soften reality's edges, to make time flow more gently. The wooden tables were scarred with use, the mugs mismatched, the songs, when they came, were slow and circular, repeating verses until the meaning dissolved into sound. Outside, snow or rain might fall endlessly, but inside, the sameness of the air, the dull warmth, the smell of malt, all of it wrapped the mind in a kind of waking sleep. If a traveler could step into one of those rooms today, they would find it unchanged in essence. The fire would still burn low, the benches would still creak, the ale would still taste faintly of earth and patience. The talk would drift without urgency, the hours would pass unnoticed, and somewhere in the corner, Someone would rest their head against the wall and close their eyes, not from drunkenness, but from the weight of the room's stillness. It was this atmosphere, this half-lit, timeless lull, that shaped the medieval soul more than any sermon or sword. Drinking became a way of existing slowly, of surrendering to the dull beauty of repetition. In every village from England to Bohemia, the tavern became the evening's heartbeat, slow and steady, the same tonight as it had been 100 years before. And in that rhythm, people found something ancient, not escape, not ecstasy, but peace. The peace of being small and patient in a world that turned endlessly, softly, without haste. After the long centuries of barley and vine, when alehouses whispered through Europe and monks kept their cool cellars breathing with quiet barrels of fermenting patience, there came another, smaller miracle, one that glowed not with warmth but with clarity. It began, as so many slow revolutions do, in the laboratories of those who were not quite priests, not quite magicians, the early alchemists of the Islamic Golden Age, in the still air of Baghdad and Damascus, where light filtered softly through latticed windows and dust hung like suspended time. Men in linen robes and copper-stained fingers leaned over glass vessels that curved like captured bubbles of the world itself. They were not seeking drunkenness. They were searching for purity, for the essence of things, the soul of liquids, the invisible within the visible. Among their furnaces and alembics, they discovered that if you warmed wine slowly and caught its rising breath, the vapor condensed into a new liquid, clear as rainwater, yet carrying the spirit of fire. They called it alcoa, meaning the purest part, the subtle powder or vapor left when matter is refined. What they made by accident was the first distilled spirit, not a drink at first, but a medicine, a perfume, a way of touching the unseen dot in those early centuries. Distillation was an act of patience that mirrored the rhythm of prayer. The copper still sat above small charcoal flames, and water dripped with the sound of measured thought. The alchemist would listen, waiting for each drop, counting breaths between them. What dripped into the receiver was something the world had not known before, a liquid so pure that it burned, yet so light it seemed to vanish on the tongue. They mixed it with herbs and called it orak, meaning sweat, for it was the perspiration of the grape's soul, the purified sigh of matter itself. Physicians wrote treatises on its uses, not for pleasure, but for healing, to disinfect wounds, to preserve herbs, to draw fragrance from flowers. It was stored in tiny flasks, stoppered with wax, and placed carefully among medicines. Yet, as centuries drifted like sand, someone somewhere must have tasted a drop too much and felt that old familiar softening of the edges, that same gentle blur known to the drinkers of Sumer and Egypt. The fire inside was sharper now, but the result was the same: warmth spreading, thoughts loosening, time slowing to a syrup. When the knowledge of the still crossed the Mediterranean, carried in manuscripts and whispers, Europe was ready for it. Monks who had long brewed beer and wine found in distillation another form of meditation. In stone abbeys surrounded by vineyards, they built small furnaces and copper coils, studying the delicate balance between heat and patience. They called the result aqua vita, the water of life, a name both ironic and sincere, for it burned yet revived. The monks believed it could preserve health, cheer the weary, and guard the spirit from decay. They distilled not for revelry, but for charity, selling tiny vials to pilgrims and nobles. The stills hissed quietly in the corners of their cloisters, the sound like long sighs in a chapel after prayer. Each drop was collected as if it were holy. They recorded temperatures by intuition, not numbers, feeling the warmth on their palms, watching the condensation bead and fall with the rhythm of a heartbeat. Outside the monasteries, peasants continued to drink their mild ales, unaware that a stronger fire was being tamed in the shadows. But word travels even when uninvited, and soon merchants and healers began to experiment. In the cold north, where wine spoiled and ale froze, distilled spirits offered a warmth that did not fade. It was portable, storable, nearly eternal. The clear liquid, once a curiosity of scholars, became a companion of travelers, soldiers, and farmers. It was mixed with honey, herbs, and berries, flavored to taste less like medicine and more like memory. The line between cure and comfort blurred softly, as it always does. The alembic's whisper turned into the clinking of cups. The monasteries might have called it salvation. The people called it solace. By the 13th century, the still had spread across Europe. Small copper shapes appearing in apothecaries and taverns alike. The same method that drew rose oil from petals now drew courage from grain. Each region gave the spirit a new name: brandy, eau-de-vie, schnapps. But the essence was the same: the capture of breath itself. In small cottages, farmers heated their leftover wine, collecting the vapors through crude pipes into clay jugs. The process was uncertain, dangerous even, for the line between distillation and fire was thin. But those who mastered it spoke of the strange beauty of seeing clarity born from confusion, of flame giving birth to liquid calm. The new drink was stronger, swifter, but even here, in its potency, there was something slow about it. The deliberate care, the waiting for drops, the silence between them through the late medieval winters, when frost gathered on window panes and the world seemed made entirely of breath and glass. People began to sip the water of life by their hearths. It burned gently, spreading a warmth that felt not of this world. Doctors prescribed it for melancholy, for fatigue, for the chill of old age. Sailors carried it on ships. Monks stored it for trade. Nobles added spices and gold leaf to it, as if wealth itself could be dissolved. Yet, no matter how ornate the vessel, the essence remained monastic, patience made visible. Distillation was, at its heart, a slow conversation between fire and water, between desire and restraint. And as the centuries crept forward, that conversation deepened, echoing through the copper throats of stills in every valley by the dawn of the Renaissance. When scholars spoke again of reason and proportion, distillation had left the cloister and entered the home. Housewives kept small stills on their hearths for perfumes and cordials. Physicians distilled mint and wormwood for tonics. And in the marketplaces, flasks of clear spirit caught the sunlight like pieces of sky. The act of drinking it remained, for most, a quiet ritual, a single sip taken against the cold, a toast at dusk, a pause between labors. In that pause, the drinker felt connected not to excitement but to continuity, to the same long thread that began with fruit left too long beneath a tree. The liquid's clarity mirrored the stillness of the mind after a long day. Even the fumes, sharp and clean, seemed to whisper of patience rewarded. Thus, the alchemist's fire, born of curiosity and devotion, became the common warmth of humanity. Another slow chapter in the endless history of how people learned to soften time itself. As the slow centuries unrolled into the dawn of the modern age, the clear fire born in the alchemist's flasks found new paths across seas and cobblestone roads, changing not through invention, but through the patient erosion of time itself. The 16th and 17th centuries were not sudden eras of transformation, but slow awakenings, when men and women, having learned to read the language of distillation, began to apply it not only to spirits, but to trade, medicine, and daily endurance. It was a time when the world began to move, but human hearts still beat to the quiet rhythm of the hearth. Ships, heavy with the scent of oak and tar, carried barrels of wine, rum, and brandy from port to port, their cargoes sloshing softly like liquid time. In taverns that lined the wharves of Lisbon, Amsterdam, and London, one could hear the slow sigh of barrels being opened, the gentle glug of liquor being poured into pewter mugs, and the indistinct murmur of traders discussing the wind. But outside that faint noise of commerce, there remained a stillness, the kind of stillness that lives in habits repeated too long, in rituals that become invisible. Distillation, once a sacred craft, had become an everyday miracle, folded into the fabric of ordinary life, in the quiet back rooms of apothecaries. Men in aprons and spectacles carefully measured the distilled spirits once used by monks. They mixed them with herbs, roots, and strange imported spices, cinnamon from Ceylon, cloves from the Moluccas, pepper from Calicut. Each mixture was recorded in small brown ledgers with looping handwriting, elixirs for digestion, for courage, for melancholy. The spirits preserved the herb's essence, keeping green life alive through winter. And as merchants realized that the same purity that preserved medicine also preserved intoxication, they began to ship distilled drinks farther across oceans and into colonies. Brandy left the vineyards of France to find its way to Africa. Rum, born from the sweat of sugarcane, made its slow voyage to Europe. The world, still lit by candles, began to hum faintly with the soft vibration of commerce. In small coastal warehouses, men rolled barrels into stacks that smelled of both sweetness and decay. Outside, gulls cried, ropes creaked, and the wind carried a faint perfume of spice and smoke. It was not yet an age of speed, but of repetition, voyages repeated until they became as predictable as prayer. And in Europe's quiet towns, the drinking itself changed its costume. Where once ale was taken with bread and wine with worship, the distilled spirits came to mark pauses between labors, an invisible punctuation in the slow sentences of the day. Peasants in the north drank schnapps before work to warm themselves. Sailors drank rum before sleep to keep the chill away. Scholars drank brandy before writing, believing it cleared the mind of fog. Each act was small, uncelebrated, and deeply human. There were no grand feasts in this slow history, only quiet cups raised at dusk, sighs shared over stoves, and the faint glow of firelight through window glass. Drinking was not rebellion yet, not pleasure in excess. It was survival in miniature, a daily negotiation with weather and weariness. The spirits gave warmth, when coal was scarce, courage when wages were low, company when silence stretched too long. The barrels in the tavern corners were as ordinary as tables and chairs, and the habit of sipping became, over time, as natural as breathing. By the 17th century, the stills had grown larger, not grander. They stood in fields and barns, connected by wooden pipes, tended by hands that knew every sound of boiling and dripping. In the cold mornings, steam rose from their copper throats, catching the light like ghostly banners. Farmers distilled their leftover grains into spirits to trade or store, for the product did not spoil. It was a slow economy, not the frantic commerce of future empires, but a circular rhythm of give and take, of harvest and return. In Scotland and Ireland, distillers began to call their work whiskey, wished, bitha, the water of life in their own tongue, a name carried from the monks who had once whispered Latin prayers beside their stills. The whiskey that flowed from their barrels was rough, young, often cloudy, but the people loved it, not for taste, but for constancy. It was something that did not change, that could be relied upon to comfort. The process of distilling became almost like a winter ritual, barley-soaked, malted, dried, mashed, fermented, and then, through copper's gentle persuasion, turned into a liquid that shimmered like amber fire. It was work done not in haste but with rhythm, slow stoking of fire, careful watching of drops, patient sealing of barrels. A day of distillation was a day of breathing in steam and wood smoke, of listening to the whisper of water turning to spirit. Meanwhile, across the oceans, where colonists cleared forests and planted sugarcane, another story dripped just as slowly. The cane was cut, crushed, boiled into syrup, and the leftover molasses, once waste, began to ferment on its own. From this humble accident came rum, darker, heavier, born of heat rather than frost. On the plantations, rum was both medicine and escape, comfort and curse. Its production was constant, the sound of boiling vats blending with the buzz of insects, the cries of gulls, and the far hum of waves. Rum became currency, traded for goods, for work, for silence. Yet, in the taverns of London, far from the fields where it was made, it was simply another warmth in the cup, another pause in the evening. There was no connection felt between the two ends of the chain. The stillness of one man's drink and another's endless labor. History moves slowly, and guilt takes longer still to ferment in the cold houses of Europe. The spirit continued its transformation into medicine. Doctors prescribed cordials flavored with mint or anise for digestion, tonics of gentian and wormwood for fevers. The apothecary's shelves gleamed with bottles of deep green and amber, each holding its own slow secret. People began to associate distilled spirits with purity, not yet with sin or vice, but with cleanliness, with something elemental and unspoiled. And so, in the calm light of early morning, when the frost still lingered on the cobbles, a sip of brandy seemed no more remarkable than a spoonful of honey. It was a comfort taken before the world's noise began. The slow drip of alcohol into the bloodstream was like the ticking of an old clock, steady, predictable, hypnotic, but as always, repetition brings its own dull echo. By the late 17th century, the same spirits that had once soothed began to appear, too often, too easily. In cities swelling with trade and smoke, taverns multiplied like reflections in mirrors. the water of life, poured into countless glasses, began to blur the very line between healing and forgetting. Yet, even here, the tone remained slow, not moral but melancholy, the kind of sadness that seeps rather than strikes. Pamphlets warned against drunkenness, preachers sighed over wasted mornings, but the habit persisted, not out of rebellion, but from routine. The slow comfort of a cup at night, a dram at dawn, was too familiar to feel wrong. Even as governments taxed and regulated, the stills kept breathing in the countryside, their copper sides dull with soot, their fires flickering like small, stubborn hearts. It was around this time that the world, once vast and disconnected, began to close in on itself through trade routes. The same ships that carried spices also carried spirits. The same ports that saw silk and tobacco saw barrels of brandy and rum. Alcohol became a quiet language between continents, a shared ritual that transcended words. In India, the Portuguese distilled arak from palm sap. In Japan, rice wine continued to be refined into sake. In the Caribbean, sailors took their daily ration of rum. In Northern Europe, peasants kept their schnapps. No one called it globalization, yet it was simply the slow seep of one habit into another, as predictable as morning dew. What had once been sacred became ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay a strange beauty, humanity endlessly repeating itself, endlessly softening the hard edges of existence with small, familiar comforts. As the 18th century approached, the distilled spirit had become as integral to civilization as bread or salt. It flowed through wars and weddings, through mourning and celebration, through solitude and company. There was nothing heroic about it anymore, nothing novel, just a quiet companion that marked the rhythm of human endurance. In a way, it was not the drink that changed history, but the history that grew dull enough to need the drink. The world had become busier, more connected, more anxious, and in the midst of all that movement, people still longed for stillness. The same stillness the monks found in their copper pots now resided in the pause before a sip. The water of life had done its work well. It had not cured humanity's ills, but it had slowed their sting, turned noise into murmur, pain into patience. Thus the age of trade was, at its core, an age of quiet dependency. People did not yet speak of addiction or excess. They spoke only of custom, of tradition. Every nation, every class had found its chosen spirit. In that small, invisible purpose lay the essence of this long, boring chapter of history. The way comfort, once discovered, becomes indistinguishable from need. And so, as barrels rolled across continents and ships creaked against their moorings, the world grew slowly intoxicated, not by pleasure, but by habit. By the 19th century, the world had grown louder, though not faster, in its soul. The slow pulse of humanity continued beneath the clatter of machines. The small copper stills that had once whispered in abbey cellars or farm sheds now stood inside brick buildings whose chimneys smoked day and night, their sighs rising into the gray industrial sky. Distillation, once a ritual of patience and scent, had become a trade of precision and volume. The same steam that drove locomotives and factories also breathed through pipes that condensed and refined the water of life by the thousands of gallons. The stillman, once a solitary figure tending his quiet flame, now walked between rows of gleaming metal vats, listening not for the drop of condensation, but for the rhythm of pistons and valves. The old patience remained, but it was now mechanical, measured by clocks instead of instinct. The spirits that dripped from the stills were purer, stronger, more consistent, yet somehow emptier, as if the soul that once rose in vapors had been distilled out of the process itself. In the towns that grew around these distilleries, the air was thick with the smell of malt and smoke. Workers arrived before dawn, their boots striking cobblestones slick with condensation, their breath mingling with the cold fog. Inside, the fires burned steadily, and the pipes hissed like distant serpents. The work was simple and repetitive. Grain in, steam up, spirit out. The men talked little, their movements practiced, their thoughts, perhaps, on home or nothing at all. In this new world of industry, even intoxication had become routine. The barrels were rolled out, branded, and sent on rail cars to cities and ports. No one marveled at them anymore. They were as common as coal or iron, the same clear liquid that once gleamed like treasure in a monk's flask, now filled warehouses by the thousand. The romance of distillation faded into the hum of machinery. Yet, for all its dullness, there was something strangely comforting in that repetition, the endless circling of work, of fire, of spirit, of rest. Meanwhile, cities swelled with workers who found in cheap gin and whiskey their only pause from labor. In London, narrow lanes filled with the smell of juniper and despair, the faint laughter of taverns spilling into the fog. The old water of life, meant for health and solace, became, in its abundance, a quiet burden. People drank not to celebrate, but to continue, not to remember, but to forget. The hours between work and sleep were soaked in a haze of slow numbness. Yet even here, in the most somber corners of the city, the act of drinking retained its rhythm, the measured pour, the brief silence, the slow exhale afterward. The glass had become a kind of clock, marking time through evenings too heavy to count. Reformers and preachers began to walk those same streets, handing out pamphlets that trembled in the damp wind, their words heavy with moral arithmetic. They spoke of temperance, of sin, of self-control, but what they were really naming was fatigue, a collective exhaustion that the world mistook for vice. Across the ocean, in America, distillation followed its own quiet trajectory. Pioneers moving west carried small stills with them, setting them beside rivers and barns, the smell of mash mingling with wood smoke and pine. Whiskey became the slow heartbeat of frontier life, not wild, not heroic, but ordinary, as constant as the creak of wagon wheels or the crackle of the hearth. Men traded jugs for tools, for grain, for trust. The still was part of the household, part of the rhythm of seasons. It was, once again, domestic, even sacred in its routine. When the Industrial Revolution reached those same lands, the small copper stills gave way to larger operations. But the memory of the quiet drip remained, like a faint echo behind the roar of progress. Every industrial invention seemed to carry within it a trace of something older, slower, gentler, the patience that no amount of steam could replace. In the laboratories of Europe, chemists began to analyze alcohol in terms of purity, strength, and measurement. No longer the alchemical mystery of the monks or the poetic spirit of philosophers. It became ethanol, SCO, a substance like any other, capable of being weighed, taxed, and categorized. Science stripped away its mystique, but not its hold on the human psyche. People continued to drink, not for wonder, but for familiarity. The factories refined it further. Governments standardized it. Merchants branded it. Each bottle that left a distillery bore a label, a name, a story invented to give life to something that had, paradoxically, lost its own. Yet behind the typography and glass, the liquid remained what it always had been, a transparent pause, a clear fragment of time suspended in taste. By the mid-19th century, the tension between comfort and control had become visible everywhere. Cities teemed with working men clutching flasks, while parlors of the wealthy shimmered with crystal decanters and imported cognac. The same liquid flowed between classes, but its meaning shifted with setting. In the manor, it was sophistication. In the alley, it was escape. Yet the two were joined by the same slow sigh after a sip, the same fleeting warmth in the chest, the same momentary stillness before life resumed. That sameness, the democratic monotony of intoxication, frightened moralists and inspired poets. Temperance movements formed not out of sudden outrage, but from a long, weary observation that too much sameness dulls the human spark. Pamphlets filled with pale engravings of broken homes and wasted wages circulated through towns. Meetings were held where speakers, with tired sincerity, described the ruin caused by drink. But even their words carried a kind of repetition, an echo of the same slow rhythm that bound the entire history of spirits: comfort, dependence, regret, renewal. And yet, amid all this moral noise, the physical world of distillation remained strangely tranquil. In Scotland, the Highland distilleries continued their ancient routines. The copper stills gleaming under soot-black roofs, the barrels stacked in cool, damp warehouses where air and spirit communed silently. Workers moved with the same patience their ancestors had, stirring, waiting, smelling, listening. Outside, mist rolled over the hills, softening the edges of everything. In Ireland, the same stories were told of water drawn from Petrich springs, of barley dried over gentle fires, of time itself used as an ingredient. The industrial age may have mechanized production, but the essence of distillation, the slow transformation of matter through patience, remained unaltered, hidden beneath the noise of progress. The stills still breathed, the barrels still aged, and the spirit still whispered of stillness, even as reformers preached and factories multiplied. There were evenings when the world seemed to pause again, a glass on a table catching the dim gaslight, a worker's tired hand holding it without thought, the liquid reflecting a small, trembling glow. That was the paradox of the industrial age. The faster everything moved, the more people sought the illusion of slowness, of rest, of silence. The glass provided that, not through pleasure, but through the temporary suspension of motion. Every sip was a miniature Sabbath in a week that no longer ended. And so, the spirit, born of fire and patience, survived not in rebellion, but in resignation. It remained, as it had always been, the invisible bridge between endurance and surrender by the century's end. As railways stitched continents and telegraphs shortened distance, the story of alcohol, of patience distilled, had become nearly universal. From the gin shops of London to the whiskey houses of Kentucky, from the brandy cellars of France to the rice wine stills of Kyoto, humanity was joined in a quiet, rhythmic dependence. No empire could conquer it. No sermon could dissolve it, because it was not simply a drink. It was a manifestation of time itself, something the human heart craved even as the world raced ahead. In the hum of the industrial city, beneath the clatter of wheels and the hiss of steam, the faint, eternal drip of the still could still be heard. If one listened closely enough, the old heartbeat of patience persisting under the iron skin of progress. It began, as most human corrections do, not with anger, but with fatigue, the deep, collective weariness of a world that had seen too many mornings blurred by the same dull fog of spirit and regret. By the turn of the 20th century, the soft hum of industry had filled every street and factory, but beneath it lingered another hum, one that trembled in the blood and the breath, the endless rhythm of drinking, of numbing, of continuing. Society, having mechanized its patience, sought now to purify its endurance. Thus was born the age of temperance, an era of meetings and moral campaigns, of leaflets fluttering through the air like tired sermons. In church basements and school halls, men and women gathered beneath weak electric lamps to speak softly of reform. They were not zealots, but tired dreamers, their hands calloused by work, their eyes shadowed by disappointment. They spoke of a better morning, one without hangover or hunger, where the world might be clear again. They passed around pamphlets printed in black ink that smelled faintly of paper and hope, their words warning of sin but trembling with pity. In those small rooms, history seemed to fold back on itself, the same old yearning for control dressed in new, quiet language. In America, where the idea of moral renewal had long mingled with the promise of reinvention, the temperance movement grew like ivy along the walls of towns. Posters appeared beside factory gates and post offices, bearing slogans that spoke not of pleasure but of cleanliness, of returning the human soul to its unclouded state. The language was domestic, homes restored, children protected, bread unspoiled. The drink, once romanticized as the water of life, had now become the thief of wages and will. Yet the rhetoric, for all its urgency, moved at the same slow pace as the world it sought to heal. Marches passed through streets with deliberate steps, banners swaying softly, brass bands playing hymns that sounded more like lullabies than protests. The preachers spoke in drawn-out cadences, their voices rising and falling like sighs. Even their outrage was slow, their righteousness weary. Behind them, the saloons continued to glow at night, their windows fogged with warmth, their patrons quiet as ghosts. The war between indulgence and restraint was fought not in bursts, but in drips. One law, one sermon, one closed door at a time. When prohibition finally came, it did not arrive with the noise of revolution, but with the hush of bureaucracy. In the early hours of a January morning in 1920, the sale of alcohol in the United States became illegal by act of law, and the silence that followed was unlike any the world had known. Taverns shut their doors, their signs taken down or covered in sheets. The air outside smelled of dust and cold iron. Barrels were rolled into streets and emptied, the amber liquid spilling into gutters like wasted sunlight. For a moment, it seemed as though an entire century had exhaled, a long sigh escaping from the lungs of civilization. Yet even as the streets dried, the thirst remained. People gathered in secret, in basements and attics, the sound of glasses replaced by the whisper of secrecy. The same liquid that had once been distilled in open light now moved through shadows, poured into unlabeled bottles, traded through glances and codes. The speakeasy replaced the tavern, but its rhythm was the same. Laughter muffled, songs sung quietly, the soft clink of glass under low lamps. Prohibition did not end drinking. It simply slowed it, made it softer, more secret, more patient. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, Europe recovered from war, and its people found in wine and brandy the same small comfort they had always known. The devastation of the trenches had left behind a silence deeper than any sermon could fill. And in that silence, a glass of red or amber became an act of remembrance rather than escape. There was no temperance there, only fatigue, only the desire to feel human again. Farmers returned to their vineyards, coopers returned to their barrels, and the old rhythm resumed. Soil, grape, fermentation, patience. In those quiet years, alcohol was not rebellion or sin. It was simply continuity. The world had changed its machines, its maps, its rulers, but not its thirst for stillness. Back in America, the noble experiment began to unravel in the same slow, predictable way that all attempts to suppress human habit, the law's silence, became unbearable. The absence of public drinking only amplified private indulgence. The same warehouses that once held legal barrels now concealed illicit ones. The police who enforced the law often turned a blind eye, their own evenings softened by the very liquid they confiscated. What had once been an act of faith became a farce repeated endlessly. The moralists grew quieter. The slogans faded from the walls. And when Prohibition finally ended in 1933, the celebration was not loud but relieved, a collective murmur, like rain returning after drought. Taverns reopened their doors with little fanfare. The dust swept out, the counters wiped clean. The old rituals resumed, as if they had never stopped. The pour, the sip, the sigh. The world had learned nothing new, only remembered that it could not live forever in denial of its own small comforts. Through all of this, the stills never stopped breathing. In remote valleys, in cramped basements, in hidden barns, the alchemist's ancient fire continued to glow. The apparatus had changed, the laws had shifted, but the principle remained, the slow transformation of matter into solace. Distillers, who once feared discovery, now perfected their craft in secrecy, learning to make purer spirits, smoother blends. Out of restriction came refinement. The irony was perfect. The attempt to suppress the habit only deepened its artistry. The clear liquid that dripped into glass jars during those quiet years carried within it the essence of rebellion, but a slow, resigned rebellion, one that whispered rather than shouted, that endured rather than defied. When the world finally emerged into the light of the mid-20th century, it carried both scars and traditions. The moral campaigns faded into memory, their pamphlets yellowing in church archives, their hymns forgotten. But the bottles returned to shelves, the bars filled again with soft noise, and the act of drinking resumed its ancient role, not a vice, not a virtue, simply a rhythm. The world, it seemed, had needed to go through prohibition only to rediscover patience, the same patience that had once guided the monk's hand over the still now guided the bartender's hand over the counter. The same sigh that once followed a sip in medieval Europe now echoed in the jazz clubs of New York. Time had turned, but the habit remained constant, as reliable as the ticking of clocks, as calm as breath. Thus, the age of prohibition, born of purity, ended not with triumph but with fatigue, a perfect circle of human effort returning to rest. The taverns reopened, the glasses refilled, and history, like a half-forgotten song, resumed its slow, hypnotic melody. The drink had survived empires, revolutions, and laws. It had flowed through prayer and crime alike. And as the 20th century began to hum with machines and neon, the distilled spirit, patient and indifferent, waited quietly on the bar, clear and eternal, ready to soften one more evening into silence. By the time the 20th century exhaled into the 21st, the story of drink, once a tale of gods and guilt, of rebellion and reform, had softened into something smaller, something almost invisible, like dust drifting in the air of a well-lit kitchen. The rituals that had once been sacred or forbidden were now simply casual gestures, repeated so often that they ceased to be noticed. The faint twist of a cap, the quiet tilt of a bottle, the small sigh of carbonation escaping into air that no longer carried mystery. Bars still lined the streets, but their light was no longer defiant. It was ambient, ordinary, part of the city's breathing. The clink of glass against glass no longer meant celebration or secrecy, only habit. In apartments stacked above one another, in restaurants filled with half-heard conversations, in lonely kitchens illuminated by the hum of the refrigerator, the same gesture continued, each pour blending into another, each sip as unremarkable as a heartbeat. It was the quiet culmination of millennia, the transformation of intoxication from a revelation to a routine, from a story to a background noise. Once, in the days of monks and mystics, the fermented drink had been a bridge between body and spirit, a symbol of transformation. Later, it had become the companion of revolution, the solace of labor, the secret of loneliness. But now it was merely part of the landscape, like electric light, like digital noise. The glass sat beside the phone, the television, the open laptop, another small comfort in an endless sea of distractions. People no longer drank to dream, nor to forget, but simply because they always had. The advertisements spoke not of ecstasy or despair, but of refreshment, smoothness, and brand identity. The old language of intoxication, the ancient poetry of Dionysus, the prayers of monks, the hymns of tavern choirs had been replaced by slogans printed in cheerful fonts. The drink, once sacred or sinful, had become another product of the machine age, filtered, standardized, sterilized, bottled in glass, so transparent it betrayed nothing of the centuries it carried. It was no longer about escape, only ease, the slow anesthetic of the ordinary in the quiet suburbs. After the long days of repetition, a man might come home, hang his coat, and pour himself a drink without thought or meaning. The sound of the liquid striking glass would merge with the hum of evening traffic, with the ticking of clocks, with the breathing of appliances. He would sit, take a sip, stare at the faint reflection of himself in the window, not quite happy, not quite sad, and think of nothing at all. In cities, groups gathered in bars built to mimic warmth, wood polished to a false age, lights dimmed to a curated glow. They spoke not of philosophy or politics, but of weather, work, and routine. Their laughter rose and fell, light as the fizz of a poured drink, fading before it reached the door. And across the planet, millions of other hands performed the same act at the same moment. A synchronized gesture of mild sedation, a ritual so ancient it had become invisible. Humanity had perfected not pleasure, but tolerance. Even the science of drink had lost its romance. Chemists measured alcohol content. Psychologists charted consumption trends. Economists studied market flow. Everything quantified, nothing mysterious. What had once been alchemy was now an equation. What had once been transformation was now a metric. The bottle label carried nutrition facts. The spirit carried none. It was as though the centuries of myth and meaning had evaporated, leaving only the residue of repetition. Yet, in the smallest ways, the old ghosts lingered. In the quiet of midnight, when the streets were empty and the city's lights pulsed faintly in the fog, someone somewhere would raise a glass and feel, if only faintly, the ancient warmth of shared humanity, the same warmth that once flickered in a Roman tavern, in a monastery cellar, in a smoky jazz bar, in a farmhouse lit by candlelight. It was not joy nor grief, only continuity. A slow remembering without words. In the modern age, to drink is no longer to rebel, nor to conform, but simply to exist within the rhythm of the ordinary. The bar stool has replaced the pew. The countertop has replaced the altar. Yet both serve the same quiet function, to hold the weight of the weary. The glass has become transparent, not only in form, but in purpose. A vessel for habit, nothing more. The ancient dream of ecstasy has given way to comfort, and comfort, in turn, has dissolved into numbness. Still, there is something oddly peaceful in this decline, a calm acceptance that humanity, after all its striving, its prohibition, its indulgence, has settled into equilibrium. The act persists, unchanged, unresisted. The first sip still carries the faint echo of ritual. The last still ends in silence. Between them lies only the gentle, endless hum of modern life. And so the story ends, not with revelation or regret, but with repetition, the purest form of history. The drink remains what it has always been, a mirror, a measure, a momentary pause. The world turns, lights flicker on and off. Generations pass, and still the same slow pour continues. The liquid gleams, the glass sweats, the air hums softly. It is the rhythm of civilization itself, steady, unremarkable, eternal. The story of drink began in fire and faith and ends in fluorescent stillness. There is no lesson left, only the steady continuation of human habit, unthinking and infinite. Somewhere, far away, a drop falls from a bottle into an empty glass. The faintest sound in the night, a sound older than memory, quieter than thought. The world breathes once more and sleeps.